Welcome to Beyond the Ages. Today, we're unlocking the brutal machines that crushed medieval walls and reshaped warfare. Let's dive straight in. The night sky burns red as stone, and fire rained down upon the fortress walls. The crash of boulders slamming into mortared stone echoes across the valley, each impact sending tremors through the earth beneath the feet of terrified defenders. On the ramparts, soldiers scramble through clouds of dust and falling debris, their screams barely audible over the thunderous percussion of war machines releasing their deadly cargo. Flames leap from oil-soaked projectiles arcing through the darkness, casting dancing shadows across faces twisted in fear and determination. This is medieval siege warfare at its most brutal, its most devastating. But how did humanity go from simple wooden contraptions to the mighty trebuchet that could shatter fortresses and bend kingdoms to their knees? To understand the evolution of siege weapons, we need to journey back beyond the medieval period, to the ancient world where engineers first learned to harness mechanical power for destruction. The earliest siege machines relied on a principle called torsion, the twisting of rope, sinew, animal hair, and fiber to store enormous amounts of energy. Picture thick bundles of rope wound so tightly that releasing them would snap an arm forward with bone-breaking force. The Greeks and Romans perfected these machines. The ballista, essentially a giant crossbow that could punch bolts through armor and flesh at incredible distances, and the scorpion, its smaller, more maneuverable cousin. These weapons transformed warfare, allowing armies to strike from ranges that seemed almost magical to those who faced them. But they had significant limitations. The organic materials used to create torsion, rope, sinew, tendons, would decay over time. Moisture weakened them. The tension would gradually diminish, requiring constant maintenance and adjustment. In humid climates or during long campaigns, these machines could become unreliable at the worst possible moments. The materials themselves would snap under repeated stress, and replacing them required specific knowledge and resources that weren't always available on campaign. Yet these ancient designs laid the groundwork. The fundamental concept, storing energy in one form and releasing it explosively to propel a projectile, would carry forward into the medieval era, though the method of storing that energy would evolve dramatically. As Rome fell and Europe entered the early medieval period, military engineers began experimenting with different approaches. The mangonel emerged as a crucial bridge between the ancient world and the siege engines that would later dominate medieval battlefields. Unlike its torsion-powered ancestors, the mangonel used a different mechanism, a single arm attached to a heavy wooden frame, powered by twisted rope or sinew, but in a configuration that was more reliable and easier to construct than the complex torsion engines of antiquity. The operator would pull down the arm, cranking it against the tension of the ropes, load a stone or other projectile into a basket or sling at the end of the arm, and then release. The arm would snap upward with devastating force, hurling its payload in a high arc toward enemy walls. The mangonel offered several advantages. It could be built relatively quickly using available materials. Its rate of fire was respectable. A skilled crew could launch several projectiles per hour. It was more mobile than many other siege engines, meaning armies could transport the components and assemble them on site. And its destructive power, while not as overwhelming as what would come later, was sufficient to damage wooden palisades, scatter defenders, and gradually wear down fortifications. Historical records tell us that mangonels saw action across medieval Europe and the Middle East. During the Crusades, both Christian and Muslim forces employed these weapons extensively. At the Siege of Nicaea in 1097, Crusader forces used mangonels to bombard the city's defenses, launching stones that crashed into towers and gates, slowly creating breaches that would eventually allow assault forces to enter. The psychological impact alone was considerable. The defenders never knew when the next stone would arrive, creating constant tension and fear. But the mangonel had its problems. Accuracy remained an issue. The complex interplay of rope tension, arm release, and projectile weight made predicting exactly where a stone would land difficult. The range was limited. The power, while significant, couldn't match what engineers were beginning to envision. Something better was needed, something revolutionary. Enter the counterweight trebuchet. the weapon that would change siege warfare forever. This machine represented a fundamental leap in military technology, and its impact on medieval warfare cannot be overstated. The trebuchet abandoned the torsion and tension principles of earlier weapons in favor of gravity itself. The design was brilliantly simple in concept, yet devastating in execution. A massive beam balanced on an axle, with a huge counterweight, often a wooden box filled with stones or sand weighing several tons, attached to the short end, and a long arm with a sling attached to the other end. When the counterweight was released, gravity pulled it downward with inexorable force, causing the long arm to whip upward and forward at tremendous speed. At the precise moment of maximum velocity, the sling would release, sending its projectile hurtling toward the target. The physics were more reliable than any tension-based system. Gravity doesn't decay, it doesn't weaken with humidity, it doesn't fatigue. The counterweight trebuchet could throw projectiles weighing 300 pounds or more distances of over 300 yards with shocking accuracy. Siege engineers learned to calibrate these machines with precision, adjusting counterweight mass, arm length, and sling release point until they could hit the same section of wall repeatedly, pulverizing stone and mortar until entire sections collapsed. The psychological terror these weapons inspired was immense. Defenders would watch the massive arm begin its swing, knowing they had mere seconds before tons of stone came crashing down. The sound alone, the creaking of timber, the rush of displaced air, the catastrophic impact, could break the morale of even hardened soldiers. At the Siege of Acre during the Third Crusade in 1191, both sides deployed trebuchets in a deadly artillery duel. The machines hurled massive stones day and night, the constant barrage preventing rest, destroying buildings, crushing defenders. Historical accounts describe stones weighing as much as a horse being launched into the city, smashing through roofs, demolishing walls, creating scenes of devastation that made continued resistance seem futile. The Mongol invasions brought these weapons to even more terrifying prominence. When Mongol forces besieged Baghdad in 1258, they deployed batteries of trebuchets that rained destruction upon the great city. The bombardment was so intense and so accurate that it broke the defenders' will. Stone after stone crashed into the same sections of wall until breaches opened wide enough for the assault forces to pour through. The fall of Baghdad, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, demonstrated just how thoroughly these machines had transformed siege warfare. No fortification, no matter how mighty, could withstand indefinite bombardment from multiple trebuchets operated by skilled crews. But these machines didn't only throw stones. This is where siege warfare enters its darkest chapter, where military necessity merged with psychological warfare to create weapons of terror. Siege engineers discovered that the true power of these machines wasn't just in breaking walls, it was in breaking spirits. They began experimenting with what we might call special ammunition. Diseased corpses, often victims of plague or other deadly illnesses, were loaded into slings and hurled over walls into besieged cities. The goal was twofold: spread disease and horrify the defenders. Imagine being a soldier on the ramparts when a decomposing body crashes through a roof near where your family shelters. The psychological impact was devastating. Flaming projectiles filled with tar, pitch, or oil would arc through the night sky like comets of death, starting fires that could rage out of control in the cramped quarters of a besieged city. Dismembered body parts, the heads of captured prisoners, severed limbs of fallen defenders, would be launched back into cities as grotesque messages: surrender or share this fate. Some besiegers would even attach letters to stones, written messages demanding surrender, describing in detail what would happen when the walls finally fell. These projectiles would land deep within the city, often in marketplaces or residential areas, ensuring the civilian population understood the horrors that awaited them. The high arcing trajectory of trebuchet projectiles made this particularly effective. Nothing inside the walls was safe. The randomness of where each projectile would land created an atmosphere of constant dread. Sleep became impossible. Civilians would huddle in cellars, never knowing if the next crash would be their last. This psychological dimension transformed trebuchets from mere siege engines into instruments of terror that could break a city's will long before its walls fell. Yet despite their awesome power, The days of these magnificent machines were numbered. The winds of change came in the form of gunpowder, first appearing in Europe during the 13th century, but not widely adopted for military use until the 14th and 15th centuries. Early cannons were unreliable, dangerous to their operators, and often less effective than well-made trebuchets, but they represented the future. Gunpowder weapons improved rapidly. Cannons became more reliable, more powerful, more accurate. They could fire repeatedly without the long reload times required by trebuchets. The projectiles moved faster, hitting walls with greater force concentrated in smaller areas. The sound alone, the ear-splitting crack of cannon fire, had its own psychological impact. By the mid-15th century, the writing was on the wall. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 marked a turning point. While both sides used traditional siege engines, it was the massive cannons of the Ottoman forces, including the legendary Basilica cannon that could fire stone balls weighing over half a ton, that ultimately breached the walls of the great city. The age of mechanical siege engines was ending. Within a few generations, trebuchets and mangonels disappeared from battlefields, becoming relics of a bygone era. The knowledge to build them became specialist history rather than essential military skill. But their legacy remains. These machines represented the pinnacle of medieval engineering, the result of centuries of accumulated knowledge about leverage, gravity, materials, and mathematics. They shaped the architecture of castles and fortifications for hundreds of years. They influenced the outcome of wars, determined the fate of kingdoms, and demonstrated that human ingenuity, even in the service of destruction, could achieve remarkable things. If you enjoyed this journey beyond the ages, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more.